Good morning, Rock Valley Chapel. This is Pastor Tim, just continuing in our Bible study in the book of Ecclesiastes. And today we come to Ecclesiastes chapter 7, and we're going to be looking at the first 13 verses today. What we're going to find is that we transition out of chapter 6, which was a collection of deep, reflective ideas kind of laid out, if you will, in sort of narrative. And now we're going to come to some classic proverbs for the next 13 verses. So you might even notice in your Bibles that the typeset looks a little bit different. The margins will increase on the left and right hand side when you get to chapter 7. And this is to reflect that we've now gone basically from kind of a narrative prose style of writing to a poetic style of writing. And what we see in Hebrew poetry is something called parallelism, where you have usually two lines, sometimes it can be more, and you have ideas that are very similar. They might be negating each other, they might be supporting each other, or even just sort of synonymous reflections on each other. Those are produced in each verse, and so it's very clear, for example, in the Hebrew that we've gone to a form of parallelism, and so this different look that you have in chapter 7 reflects the fact that we've now gone into Hebrew poetry. So let me read these 13 verses and then just make a few comments along the way. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fools. This also is vanity. Surely oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the bosom of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God, who can make straight what he has made crooked. So you can tell, even as I read through that, and as you read through it yourself, these these sort of proverbial statements reflect something closer to what you might read, say, in the book of Proverbs. It's a collection of axioms, aphorisms, maxims, wise sayings that are usually kind of short and have one main point for us. So it's a little less reflective and a little bit more what we might say pithy, short with a little bit of rhyme to it, a little bit of rhythm to it, but ultimately has one lesson that it wants to convey. So, let's take a look at verse 1. A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death than the day of birth. So I think the idea behind here is that when you come to the end of your life, it is important for the person who fears the Lord to have a reputation that's revered, that's respected, that people will cherish. And we talked a little bit about this yesterday when you talk about your own funeral. What do you want people to say about you when you die and you know they're going to gather to remember you? First of all, you hope, based on what we saw yesterday, that people would be there at your funeral, that they would come to mourn and remember you because of a life that was lived well for the glory of God and for the love of human beings. And so Solomon is saying here, it's better to have a good name than to be somebody who has a precious ointment that maybe make them smell better or reflects on them having a wealthy life that they could afford basic perfumes. It's better to be poor and have a good name than to be wealthy and smell good and not have a good name. And the day of death is better than the day of birth is a reflection, I think, on if you have a good reputation all the way to your death, that's a good thing. But if you're still alive, there's time for your reputation to be tarnished. And so I think Solomon is saying it's great to have a good name, and there is no time like your death when your good name means more. That's when people come to remember you. So he's starting to transition into good reflections on the end of our lives, because the more we think about the end, the better we're going to live today. So we get this idea, again, I think, somewhat similarly in verse 2. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. When you go to a funeral, you have greater opportunity to reflect on your own mortality. We tend to think about things in deeper ways. We tend to have more meaningful conversations with people, not just as we think about the deceased, but as we think about life in general. Oftentimes, families will come together for a funeral and realize they haven't been as close as they should be, and they might make some intentional decisions to get together more frequently, to talk about things that deeply matter, to pray with one another. All kinds of fundamentally fruitful, helpful, productive, constructive things can come out of being at a place where people are mourning, because it forces us to reflect and think. By contrast, when we are constantly exposed to parties and frivolity, the kinds of discussions that go on there are very superficial and thin, and they have very little significance often to our lives. We don't take the time to reflect. We're just too busy enjoying sort of the party. Now, there's a time, just as we saw in chapter 3, there's a season for rejoicing and there's a season for mourning. But what Solomon is saying is here is we do our better thinking about life and how we're going to make decisions and how we choose to live when we go to places of sorrow and mourning. I think primarily referring to funerals. And in my own ministry and in your own lives, I'm sure you've recognized this as well. In my own ministry, I would prefer to preach a funeral than a wedding when it comes to opportunities for the gospel to go forth clearly. At a wedding, it's a joyous time. Everybody loves it. I love it. It's a time of rejoicing that a young couple has fallen in love with each other and made a commitment to each other. Families are coming together. The bride looks beautiful. The cake is there. The bridesmaids, the groomsmen. Everybody's wearing their best. They're happy. They're delighted. There's a dance afterward and food and usually a lot of alcohol. And then there's a honeymoon. It's all kinds of really celebratory things. And in that environment, it's pretty hard to preach the gospel, let me just say, because people are more concerned about the beautiful dress that the bride is wearing. And you know what? In that moment, that's what they should be thinking about. And I understand that. Nevertheless, to me, there's nothing more important than the gospel. And so at weddings, I preach the gospel. But when I'm at a funeral, the mood is completely different. And more times than not, people are going to be paying close attention to the gospel. They're going to be thinking about the end of their lives. They're going to be asking themselves, are they right with God? They're not as concerned about whether they're right with God at a wedding. But people will be more concerned about those kinds of things at a funeral. And so this is why Solomon says what he says in verse 2, and I think it's a similar concept in verse 3. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. It's a similar idea. When we're thinking about things that are a little bit more serious, and typically when we're sad, it's because somebody's passed away. We've lost a job. We're stuck in our homes because of COVID-19. We have friends who are suffering in the hospital. We have friends who own restaurants that are dying. We have people who have some kind of employment that are no longer able to go there and earn income. We have people who are sick and don't know whether they should go to the hospital. These things, these thoughts and experiences bring about sadness, but they do force us to reflect and then discover that small things can produce all kinds of gladness. And I think that's what we see here in verse 3. And then in verses 4 through 6, we get the concept that it's better to be around somebody who is going through these issues that we're talking about, which typically are wise people, wise conversations. It's better to be around that than to be around a whole bunch of laughter. So I think we can kind of see that in verse 4. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, just like we were talking, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. So when somebody who I respect, who I know is wise and is following the Lord, rebukes me or offers some kind of counsel to me that maybe I wasn't expecting, I find that to be far more significant and have a much greater impact on my life and how I think than when somebody who's always happy and joyful and tells me that I'm doing great and really never has anything negative to say. You know, some of those comments don't really go very deep. And sometimes you get comments from people that are not following the Lord, and those comments can also have significance, but they have to be weighed relative to the person who's offering them. And so the point here is a good one, and it's the same thing in verse 6. When we get a rebuke from somebody who we respect, who we know is to be wise, we pay attention, we listen, and it might have an impact and help us to do things a little differently. But if we choose to spend our time around people that just tell us what we want to hear, then we know we're setting ourselves up for a lack of growth. We're going to grow when wise people take the time to invest and point out things that we should be doing it a little differently. And I hope in my life I continue to surround myself, I intend to surround myself with people who will be quick to rebuke when they see something wrong. And at the same time, I hope that I can be that kind of wise person for others to point out things that could be done differently, and that hopefully the recipient of that message would take it to heart and maybe change some things in their lives. Well, I've noticed that we're about 12 minutes into this. I've got another 7 verses to go, so I think we're going to stop here. I'm going to change gears here just a little bit so this doesn't go too long, and we'll finish the end of Ecclesiastes 7 tomorrow, picking up on these proverbs that Kohelet offers us. But let's take some time and to reflect on some of the things that we see in this particular passage, and how we want to be intentional about being around wise people and being in those places where wise people tend to congregate, and take the time to listen to them, absorb what they have to say, and then put them into practice in our own lives. And as we think about our funerals, what are people going to say about us? What are people going to say about you? Are they going to say that this person was a follower of Jesus Christ, who was wise and willing to help and offer wisdom when I needed it? Or are they just going to remember you as somebody who kind of went through the motions? I pray that's something we consider very seriously in these coming days. And I pray that we would pray for our frontline workers, for our medical workers who are doing just an extraordinary job, for those in our community who are suffering, for people who have lost businesses, people who've been laid off from work and can't easily get some of the government assistance, at least at this point, that they've been promised, because this is a massive problem around the country. Pray for our president. Pray for our president and those specialists that he has surrounded himself with, that they would be making wise decisions on behalf of the nation and indeed of the world. Certainly pray for our governor as well, who will have a great deal of latitude to make decisions for the sake of Wisconsin, and for our city officials as well, who have to make daily decisions that impact our lives. So thank you for your time. I pray you have a blessed day. God bless you.